Hi, Susan here. Okay, today we're going to talk about the difference between vintage, retro, and antique, and that's what's next. Okay guys, if you're just tuning in for the first time and you're seeing me, I hope you're going to love this video and you give it a thumbs up and you subscribe so you can see my other videos. I have a whole series of videos from how to make a lace gown project from scratch to interviews to tools and techniques to be a fashion designer. So today this subject's kind of been bugging me for a while, and it kind of came to the surface recently because there's been a lot of talk lately, guys, about vintage this, vintage that, vintage Louis, vintage clothing, vintage camera equipment, vintage sewing machines, vintage everything, right? What is this? And why is it so important? And what is the difference between it being vintage and old? Okay, so the definition first in vintage is that the item has to be 20 years or older. I like to think that a vintage piece is at least 30 years. That's to me a true vintage piece. And that means that the item was made, obviously 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and it can go up. Antique is something that is made at least 100 years ago. But I question that because in clothing, I like to think that some of these antiques are probably in the 50-year range and above. So that is more like what I think is a true antique in clothing rather than in items like furniture or dressers or whatever else. Retro is something that is actually new. It's made in modern day, but it is inspired by a past generation or a past decade. For instance, if something is trending right now in the 70s and 80s, you see it now in a local store or Old Navy or one of those places, that is considered retro. It's a copy of an important piece or from an era in the past. And the retros can be done more than once. There could have been a resurgence of a retro happening again and again. So be careful with that. And old just means old. Old is in that dead space, guys, of 5 to 10 years, not quite 20 years, has no significance, has no social inspiration. And then there are also the reasons for these different things to be financially profitable, and that's why this huge market of vintage this, vintage that. Be careful when people are saying, especially when you're buying a Louis Vuitton or one of those type of things, when they're saying it's vintage and it's not. It's got to be at least 20 or 30 years old to be in that category, and anything other than that is just plain old. And what I want to also clarify with vintage is that vintage has an importance, meaning it is targeting a specific look from the past that was important then and is also resurging in importance now. That makes vintage valuable versus something who's just plain old, okay? You can get the same bag that is 10 years, 15 years, but it had no relevance, it had no significance to a certain design element or a trend that was going on at the time, and it's not going to have the same value as something that is true vintage that was inspired and had a certain element that was significant back then as well as the present day, if that makes sense. So I'm hoping that this makes a little bit of sense to you. I was never a fan of antiques or vintage clothing because I always used to think, and I still kind of think, that if you're past, I'd say 35, 40, wearing a lot of that, meaning covered from head to toe in vintage, it's just going to make you look old, right? It's going to make you look dated, like you maybe pull that out of your closet. But taking a significant piece of vintage clothing and putting it with new elements as well can be very fun and for any age. But now, because vintage is making such a comeback and is getting so much money on the internet as far as clothing and purses and items and furniture, that I thought I would kind of talk about it. So in other words, it still goes with supply and demand. If no one is seeking that garment or that item, it doesn't have the same kind of value that you think it would. but a well-preserved vintage piece, whether it's clothing, a purse, furniture, or equipment, will always give more return on your dollar than just something that's just plain old, guys. All right, I hope that makes sense. If you love this video, give it a thumbs up. Share it with your friends. I'd love to have a conversation about this, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.